The core issue in the case was whether the government could punish this young man for expressing his opposition to the war publicly.
My daughter couldn't play baseball, and she wanted to. That's what it came down to. Equality, equal rights.
We can't walk down the street celebrating who we are, and we knew it was wrong.
Every time a new one came up, the ACLU was right there with Planned Parenthood and other organizations to challenge it.
There were definitely some times where it wasn't so easy. We got hate mail and threatening phone calls.
Civil rights is always on the front burner. In our community, civil rights are always a part of our everyday life.
For 5 decades, the Rhode Island ACLU has fought to preserve and protect the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights. From the District Courthouse to the U.S. Supreme Court, from City Hall to the State House, through public education and policy advocacy, the Rhode Island ACLU fights for the civil rights of all Rhode Islanders. Each victory extends far beyond the particular case or legislation. They impact the lives of all Rhode Islanders, forward the progress of our state in ensuring civil rights for all, and at times even change the national legal landscape. The Rhode Island ACLU was founded by Milton Stanzler and a group of other dedicated individuals as a nonprofit, nonpartisan affiliate of the National ACLU.
There were a lot of issues about women's rights, prisoners' rights, discrimination in housing, discrimination in employment. We had discrimination in voting.
One of the Rhode Island ACLU's earliest cases, the case of Bruce Murray, a Peace Corps volunteer who wrote a public letter protesting the Vietnam War that appeared in the New York Times. In retaliation, he was drafted into the Army.
As a Peace Corps member, he was exempt from the draft. And when he wrote this letter, all of a sudden, magically, he was reclassified. He was fired from the Peace Corps, brought home from Chile, and told that he was now being drafted into the Army. It was one of the first of the major free speech cases that grew out of the Vietnam War issues.
It might be difficult for young women today to imagine the discrimination and inequality facing women and girls in the 1970s. In this case, a determined young girl, Allison Pookie Fortin, wanted to play baseball.
Congress mandated that the little leagues around the country would have to accept girls on the baseball teams as equal with the boys. Even though they passed that law, Darlington American Little League said they wouldn't follow that law. But I said, basically, you're a girl and you have the same rights as a boy. And if you want to do something and it's legal and the boys can do it, so can you.
The Rhode Island ACLU took their case with Stephen Fortunato Jr. as the lead attorney.
Steve was a very smart man, and he managed to get the best out of Allison. We were always part of the process, part of a team. I'll never forget the first day that we went to court in Providence, and we had to run a gauntlet of parents on each side of the sidewalk.
Despite the hardships of the case, Allison and her parents understood that by fighting for her rights, they were helping young girls everywhere. In the 1970s, gay men and lesbians faced blatant discrimination and harassment, so it was a brave step for Bel Pellegrino's little church to decide to hold a parade as part of the state's bicentennial activities in 1976.
We not only wanted the right to march, we wanted the right to be included as part of the Rhode Island Bicentennial listing of events. We, in fact, were trying to get the old State House, and they said absolutely not, they weren't going to let us into the old State House. So we went to the ACLU, and they said absolutely they would take our case. It was definitely human rights. We had the right to march just as much as anybody else did. standing in the middle of the streets and just walking and singing was freeing. I knew what we lived all the time. I did not want the young people coming up to go through it. If we had not had the ACLU, there would not be a Pride Fest. We wouldn't be in the State House fighting for marriage equality. We'd still be trying to fight to get the first Pride Parade.
The ACLU fights to defend free speech and free expression, regardless of whom the speech might offend. In 1978, the Rhode Island ACLU defended RISD students and faculty who put on a themed art show called Private Parts, featuring, as you might expect, some private parts.
It got a little bit of interesting press, and then one of the local members of the city council denounced it without having viewed it, based on a just enacted obscenity statute. The police, armed with the warrant, went in. The police were vested with the authority to exercise their own judgment as to what met the standards and what didn't, and they basically took everything off the wall. They intimidated and chilled exhibitors who were now afraid of being arrested. That was meat and potatoes ACLU.
The Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision in 1973 was a milestone for protecting women's reproductive rights, but it was only the beginning of an ongoing battle against constant legislative and court challenges.
Planned Parenthood versus Board of Medical Review, the challenge to the requirement of spousal notification before termination, was one of the first decisions in the nation that struck down that requirement. The legislative initiatives are ongoing, and every year there's something in the legislature, the local legislature, that would restrict reproductive rights. It's something that we always have to be vigilant about.
Middle school student Deborah Weissman and her parents, active ACLU members Dan and Vivian Weissman, brought suit against her middle school for having a prayer at the graduation. With the ACLU at their side, they began a long, difficult, and ultimately triumphant journey all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
I think we understood how lucky we were to be sitting and watching, and we were in the first row. It gave me a real education in the court system. I wasn't one who picked up on those things very easily in school, so living through it was fantastic. There were definitely some times where it wasn't so easy. We got hate mail and threatening phone calls, and my parents were really great about shielding us from a lot of it. Our lawyer, Sandra Blanding, who's now Sandra Lonnie, was fantastic. It was all her work, it was all her doing, but she was willing and almost eager to share the spotlight with my father and with us.
From the tumultuous 1960s through to today, the Rhode Island ACLU stands shoulder to shoulder with community leaders and groups such as the Civil Rights Roundtable to protect immigrant and minority communities from such issues as discrimination, hate crimes, and racial profiling.
For me, the most important bill that I've worked on is the racial profiling bill, or as we call it, driving while black. The ACLU was an intricate part of the passing of that bill, walking it through the State House, day after day, year after year, hearing after hearing. If we didn't have an organization like the ACLU, if we didn't have people like Steve Brown, if we didn't have the Civil Rights Roundtable, some of the progress that we've made would not have been made.
In a half-century, the ACLU has scored countless victories and moved Rhode Island and the nation forward in protecting and preserving our civil liberties. Their work has opened up opportunities and preserved the freedoms of individuals, created a more equal and tolerant society, and worked to make our legal and law enforcement systems more open and just.
And now that it's been here for 50 years, you have an organization that has a certain reputation, it has a certain status in the community, and it's listened to. You find if you are not vigilant that the rights that you thought you had won become eroded.
The ACLU is one of these organizations that actually fights for people whether or not they agree with the ACLU.
They were there, they backed us, they took nothing from us, we didn't have anything. We were a little church and they got us through it, and we won.
I think they're really truly practitioners of democracy.